Well, I'm very, very excited to present the third episode of the Botany Bistro, and thank you all so much for joining us today. I am going to be discussing some of the current research in botany, and I have talked to a couple of botanists to ask them their opinions on the future of where botany is going, and so that'll be our day today. If any of you did your homework and spent a little bit of time trying to germinate some of the seeds in your kitchen, we'd love to hear about that. At the end, I will turn on the chat and we can all have a little bit of conversation with each other. So if you're new to the Botany Bistro, welcome. This is a virtual Lunch and Learn series that we launched at the beginning of the month. And we will hold it every other Friday. And then we are presenting from the Civic Garden Center here in Avondale, which is a neighborhood in Cincinnati. The Civic Garden Center has been around since 1942, telling people how to sustainably garden and enjoy nature responsibly. And so I'm very happy to be a part of this team. We launched the Bistro as a free opportunity for learning because we're just passionate about sharing this information, but also because we want to be able to be in the conversation for current research and how that research is informing the activities and programs we have here at the Civic Garden Center, and also the future partnerships that we are going to be planning so that we're really on the front line of making sure we are focused on our ecology subjects and making our education available to all in the community. And so without further ado, I am going to get started here. My name's Mary Dudley. I am the Ecology Education Manager. I do a lot of programming here at Civic, but I'm very passionate about botany. I do have a botany degree from Miami University, and I can't get enough of plants. So I just enjoy plants very much, and I'm very happy to be able to continue this conversation with all of you today. So I think we've got a good group that have joined, and so we'll get started. And so today we are going to be talking about the exciting research and current state of what's happening in botany and project a little bit into the future. We're carrying off of session 2, where we learned about some historical botanists and standing on the shoulders of those who have come before. Next time we meet in a couple of weeks, we'll be talking about plant morphology, which is the external structure of plants, and specifically we're going to get into details about leaves. And so for session 1, your homework was to study a leaf intensely for a minute and see all of those beautiful details that that leaf holds. And so we'll really be taking that to the next level when we have our morphology session. So please plan to join us for that in a couple weeks. But let's find out what's for lunch today. And today I have brought some rice and beans. There's some corn in here, a little bit of onions. So it's a really tasty treat. I'm really excited about my lunch today. I used a non-traditional oil on this, and so I used sunflower oil instead of my usual olive oil, and I'll let you know why. That has something to do with what we're going to discuss today. So we're going to start by going to play paintball. And you might not think that that's something that you would be talking about in a botany class. But this particular researcher has found a way to combine the use of paintball along with their field research. And so I was introduced to this particular project when I was at a virtual botany conference a couple of years ago, and was just so excited about it, especially since I was teaching high schoolers at the time. And I'm like, oh, this is the perfect way to get these high schoolers excited about plants. And so in Mexico, there are some researchers working on a problem that we might not even consider here in the States, but when we are planning for holiday parties and we're getting together and gathering around with our friends and families, we might occasionally see a little bit of mistletoe. Usually I've seen it in its, the plastic variety, but occasionally you can see the live variety. You can buy mistletoe. It's one of those little kind of just traditions that we have. Hang it up and see if you can catch a kiss underneath. But mistletoe is not a welcome plant in most ecosystems. It's parasitic, and so it grows on other plants. And it often grows very high in the crook of a tree. It makes it very hard to access in order to remove it from ecosystems. And so this researcher has created a modified paintball gun, which can shoot pellets of herbicide. So you put some herbicide in this pellet and then shoot it from this gun, and you're safe on the ground. You don't have to climb up into these trees, but you're able to target specifically this parasitic plant, this mistletoe, and try to save the host tree before this parasitic plant can do very much damage. And so I just thought that was a really incredibly creative way of using some of the tools that we have available and also solving an ecological issue. And so as we think a little bit more about this problem that researchers were finding, we need to know a lot about symbiosis. And there are several different types of symbiosis in nature and in plant communities. And symbiosis very loosely just means living and existing together. Symbiotic relationships are not always positive. So there are different sections of symbiosis. You have mutualism, where both of the species benefit. You can have commensalism, where maybe it's not really bothering one or the other. One of them's benefiting, but one of them's not. And you have parasitism, which is our example for mistletoe, where that plant will actually kill its host eventually. It starts to infiltrate the branches of its host, and it can actually penetrate the host and then suck out the nutrients that the host plant is getting. And so it disables those systems for the host. There is actually, when I was looking it up, a piece of a root-like structure. It's called a haustorium, Haustorium. And it grows around another structure to absorb water or nutrients. And so this is a common adaptation that members of the mistletoe group have, which is also in the broomrape family, and it penetrates the tissues and draws out these nutrients. So if we're in the woods and we're able to have our trusty paintball rifle with us and we're shooting down some of those parasitic plants, it really does benefit the rest of the environment. And so we have other examples that we can show of symbiotic relationships that you might be familiar with. One positive relationship, a mutualistic relationship example, is lichen. Lichen actually includes both algae and fungus living together in a community. And so it's two organisms that have found that they work better together. And so the photosynthetic properties of the cyanobacteria, the blue-green algae, working together with the fungus and forming that lichen makes a very strong partnership. And so when we look at lichen, we might say, oh, it's just, we look at it kind of as a singular plant, but there's a lot more complexities happening there. So that's really exciting. Another one you may have heard of is how some plants are able to fix nitrogen. This is something that's fairly common with our legume family. So thinking like soybeans, peas. The way that happens, it's actually not the plant doing it on its own. It's the ability of the plant to form these mutualistic relationships with different bacteria. Rhizobacteria are present in our soils, and differing amounts depending on what soil type you're in or what ecosystem you are in. And those bacteria are able to form nodules on the roots of some of our legume plants. And those nodules are able to extract nitrogen in a way that plants are not able to do alone. And so it makes more nitrogen available to the plant. It's also beneficial because we can add this bacteria to soils that are low in it. And so the availability of that bacteria as it increases also helps the plants be able to form these mutualistic relationships. So those might be a couple that you have heard of. You might be thinking, what is the bacteria getting? You know, like how is it mutual? But actually they have found that the plant gives carbohydrates to these bacteria in exchange for this nitrogen fixation. So really cool stuff, really, really complex and complicated when we really look at it. So that's a little bit about paintball and botany. Those two go together. We're going to shift gears to learn about another type of research. But before we're able to talk about the current and the future research in this next story, we need to backpedal a little bit and introduce you to one of the superstars of the botany research world, and that is Arabidopsis. So Arabidopsis is a group of plants in the mustard family, and research on this particular plant has been going on for decades, heavily for at least 50 years. It was one of the first plants to be fully sequenced in its genome. And so it provided a lot of opportunities for research and for having kind of a model plant, a model species that we could work from. And so the full genome was sequenced in 2000, and it was the first time we had all the genes mapped out that are necessary for plant function, and also noticing all these genes we didn't know anything about, and gives us an opportunity to research those and find parallels. Genome of Arabidopsis was chosen because it's fairly small. It contains about 125 megabases and encodes about 25,000 genes. It has genes that match members of other large families, and so the hope is that we can use this model plant to apply research in other areas. So it grows very quickly. It creates a lot of seeds. A single Arabidopsis plant can create 3,000 to 4,000 seeds in its cycle. And so that's been very exciting to see how people are using this particular plant in different types of research. So you might hear the word Arabidopsis come up a couple times. If you're wondering how to spell it, it's Arabidopsis. And I've also heard them called fast plants in certain research. So that's just a little bit of background on this particular plant before I introduce our next researcher, who's working at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. His name is Dr. John Z. Kiss, and actually he was one of my professors when I was getting my undergraduate degree at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. And this research that he's doing is so exciting because he's actually sending plants on the International Space Station to experiment how we're going to be able to grow plants on Mars, particularly. So really future thinking here for some of this. But he wanted to choose a plant that could grow easily, that could grow quickly, could have several generations. It's also fairly easy to mutate Arabidopsis, and so you can insert genes and you can isolate genes. And so that's really exciting. So John's work particularly focuses on tropism. So we're going to talk a little bit more about tropisms in plants, but his was concerned with gravitropism. And so we call that a response that a plant has to gravity. And we don't really need to think about that here on Earth, that when we plant seeds that the roots will grow down and the shoots will grow up. But in our space travels, it is something that needs to be thought of, because if the plant doesn't have that that stimulus, gravity, then it can't respond to it. And so how do plants learn how to grow in different low gravity environments? Thankfully, we can all breathe easy. His research did find that there is enough gravity on Mars to be able to grow plants so, without a lot of extra supports. But the moon and in space station situation, that's a little bit different. So they are tweaking some of that research to make sure that they're able to continue these plant experiments and really study how the plants are responding to these different environments. And so thinking about different ways that plants respond to stimuli, the way that you can kind of consider your own experience in this part of botany where we study tropisms is response to light, so phototropism. If you've had a experience starting seeds on your windowsill and you see how they all kind of lean towards the sun. And occasionally for your houseplants too, you'll have to turn them every once in a while. That is phototropism, so they are going towards the light source. It's a positive phototropism, so it's going towards that. There are other types of tropisms, like we mentioned with gravitropism. There's also thermotropism, which is response to temperature. There is chemotropism, so different chemical stimuli. Hydrotropism, which is response to water. And these can all be positive or negative. They can go towards or away. And so those studies have been very exciting for people to learn how plants respond to different stimulus. The reason why I chose to have some sunflower oil on my lunch today is because of the heliotropism that sunflowers exhibit. And so it's very neat to think of something that was known many generations ago, and yet we are still a little bit new to figure out sometimes why this happens. But the sunflower head will follow the path of the sun throughout the day. And if you look at a field of sunflowers in the morning, those heads will not be pointing in that same direction at noon or at 3. And the ability of that plant to follow the sun in that way is fairly unique. And so heliotropism and the genus of sunflowers, which is Helianthus, really go together. And so I just think that that's, one of those matches that seems to really fit. So sometimes we don't have the words or all the research for something, but this has been observed in sunflower species for a long time. And so heliotropism is something that's really neat. If you look at some time release videos of how these sunflowers move during the day, I think you'll be quite impressed. And so the last type of tropism that I'm going to introduce today is, I got one more friend that wants to come. Hello. The last type of tropism that I'm going to introduce today is called thigmotropism. And this is something that you may have seen in a plant that we love to use with children here at the Civic Garden Center called Mimosa pudica. And these leaves on this plant, there are several leaflets, and they respond to touch. And so thigmotropism is the response to touch or physical contact. And so Mimosa pudica plants are also called sensitive plant or touch me not. And when you touch these leaves, they will fold up. And how does that happen? So this touch leads to potassium and chlorine ions exiting the cells. As they exit the cells, this reduced concentration of ions and the increase of the ions outside the cells creates a chemical gradient, which starts the process of osmosis, of water leaving those cells. When the water moves out of the cell, the turgor pressure decreases and the cell becomes flaccid. So we mentioned a historical, possibly the first botanist, Theophrastus, last time we had a session. And Theophrastus actually wrote about this type of tropism in his records. And so we don't know if it was exactly Mimosa pudica that he was describing, but this was an observation that was made a long time ago and can still be something that's very fun. So if you have children in your life, or if you're just interested in a very novel plant, you can go out and try to get a Mimosa pudica and enjoy giving it a little touch every now and again and seeing how quickly that plant will respond to that stimuli. All right, so we've talked about paintball. We talked about going to Mars. And we talked a little bit about tropisms. Next, we're going to talk about a field of research that is kind of urgent. And so that involves the way plants utilize water. We all know that plants need water to survive. Plants use quite a bit of water during their photosynthetic processes. And the amount of fresh water that's available for agriculture is very limited. Actually, less than 3% of water on Earth is fresh water, and the majority of that is locked up in ice. And so we need to be very conscientious about how we use water, and plants that can use less water are becoming more and more desirable as our Earth's population grows, and we need to be able to feed a growing population. So saline tolerance is an area of research that is gaining a lot of traction. It's been researched for about 40 years, but it's starting to get a lot more international attention. And the ability to use salt water specifically to water plants. And most of the plants that we eat on a daily basis are not going to be able to use any type of salt water because of that osmosis that we talked about. And so as plants are introduced to a saline environment, the water uptake of that plant will also take up those crystals, and so it ends up kind of poisoning the plant, and the plant is not able to get all of the water that it needs to travel throughout its system. And so knowing how we can use plants that are adapted to salt environments is going to be really important moving forward. So some of the research is happening pretty close to home, down south in Florida in the mangrove regions. And so mangroves are plants that will grow in saline environments. They actually form pretty beautiful thickets, and their roots are very curious to look at. And so when I lived in Florida, I loved driving around the mangroves. We've lost a lot of mangrove habitat because, surprise, they tend to like a good ocean view. And typically so do humans. And so a lot of mangroves have been destroyed over time. But we are restoring a lot of those habitats, and so hopefully we'll be able to learn a lot about these plants now that we have found that they have a lot of good things to teach us. And so when we think about the use of water and the plants that can grow in saline environments, these are not necessarily going to be plants that we want to eat right away, but they can be used for animal feed and fodder for other species. And so that's where a lot of the research is happening now, is to think about how can we grow these plants and then use that to feed animals in different areas. So we call those halophytes. That means that they are salt-loving. These are going to be growing in places like salt marshes, seashores, saline deserts. And there's different tolerances for different levels of salt water in these different plants. And so they have a lot to show us and teach us as we start to research that. What we're finding is the South American seed crop quinoa, which has been cultivated for a long, long time, is a very important crop, is able to cope with some levels of salinity and has a pretty good tolerance. And so that's one of the ones that we're really paying attention to right now. And there are some producers in Bolivia that are practicing different types of growing and different types of irrigation with different levels of salt water. What they're finding is that the grain yield is lower than it would be if you were growing with fresh water, but it's not non-existent. So there's hope for that research moving forward. That's very exciting. So to think about how researchers would approach a problem like that and think about salinity, we need to think a little bit about how plants absorb water. And so they do that through their roots, but also they can pull water from the air, and how it travels through the plants. And so it travels in these vascular bundles, which are made up of something called xylem and phloem. Xylem is the highway, the waterway for the plant, and that moves water all over the plant from roots to leaves and back down again. And then phloem is going to be moving sugars around the plant, typically from the photosynthetic parts of the plant, which is mostly going to be the leaves, and moving that back down to the roots that need those sugars to be able to continue to grow. And so when we're thinking about how xylem and phloem are placed inside a plant, we can think about tree rings. If you've ever been to a nature center where they're showing off a huge tree and you can count all those rings, or even just a small cross-section of something that maybe you have pruned in your yard, you can look inside these woody species and see these rings. Now, where did these rings come from? These rings are actually the visible remains of xylem. And so the xylem only lives for a season, and then new xylem is formed in a new season. And so as that xylem dies, it leaves a ring. And so I am going to talk to you a little bit about xylem. It's made of vessels that are connected end to end in order to have maximum speed for water moving around. Trees require a lot of water. So a large apple tree in full leaf can absorb as much as 95 gallons of water from the soil every day. Most of that water will go to the leaves, and on a sunny summer day, some trees move water through their trunks at a rate of 3 feet per minute. I was also reading that a tree's wood is about half water. And so as a side note, I do often hear from people that they want to mitigate a problem in their yard that might have something to do with flooding. And so thinking about these trees as water towers, essentially, the first question I usually ask is, was a large tree removed from either your home or a neighboring property? And the amount of water that tree was taking up seems to usually match the problems that they're having in their yard. And so we really need to be conscientious of how we treat the trees in our spaces. And if we are going to need to remove a tree, understanding that there is going to be an excess of water now. So whether that's fixed with intentional planting or the building of a rain garden, something has to happen because there was a significant removal of that water tower. But I digress. So let's go back to xylem. These rings will form every year, and the xylem is connected to the phloem in a vascular bundle. The phloem continues to live, and as trees grow outward, the phloem is towards the trunk is towards the outside of the trunk, and then the xylem is a set of cells just on the other side of the phloem. And so the phloem is going to be where the sap comes from. That's where the sugars are. And so in the spring, new cells are added very quickly. The tree is increasing in diameter, and the growth of this quick addition of large cells, we have lots of water uptake, kind of appears in a growth ring as a wide light-colored band. We call that spring wood, it's early wood. And then the season continues on, and during the summer and fall, we tend to have a little bit less water uptake and slower growth. And those parts of xylem are narrower and darker, and then we go into our dormant season. So one light band and one dark band together make up a single year of growth, and that is the annual ring. So you're really counting xylem when you're looking at rings. Wide light rings can tell us something about weather. Typically in the spring we have more water, warm days, good growing conditions, and so that's seen by those wider parts of the bands. But if you see springwood rings that are very narrow, that can tell you something about the climate of the time and say, oh, there must have been a drought. Stressful growing conditions can also do that. The narrower rings could say that it was shaded, or if it was crowded by other trees, or maybe had an insect pest as well. So there's so much that we can learn just from studying the xylem of a tree. And now that researchers are really digging deep into how that water uptake works and thinking about ways to use different types of water sources, I find that that research is growing very quickly. All right, so the next section that we're going to talk about, we have two more kind of budding areas of botany that we'll talk about today. The next one is genetically modified organisms, or GMOs. Now, everyone might have their own opinion on genetically modified organisms and how they fit into their personal lives, but there are some very interesting areas of research that are happening with GMOs. One of the first GMOs that was commercially grown and granted license for human consumption was called the Flavor Savor tomato. And that was developed by a California company in the 80s and was sold from 94 to 97. It was discontinued because of mounting costs. But the whole reason why these researchers created this Flavor Savor tomato was that it had an elongated shelf life because the maturation and ripening processes were halted with the introduction of another organism's DNA. And so we have several genetically modified organisms that are kind of in our lives and in process. We have plants that glow in the dark. So if you want to take a look at some of the research coming out of MIT, they're producing plants that glow using the, I think it's a protein, but I know it's something that comes from fireflies. It's so they're taking a little bit of that DNA and having it be coded inside a plant and making plants that glow. I don't have a glowing plant yet, but that could be kind of fun. And there's also a project where they're introducing different carbon nanotubes into spinach plants, and then those plants could grow in areas that might have been polluted. And so the plants actually with these carbon nanotubes are able to respond when there are explosive chemicals in the groundwater. And so this infrared response that it puts out can be captured on a smartphone or another type of camera, and then it can be relayed through an email or another type of notice that there are explosive reagents in the groundwater. So using plants as a way to really give us these signals. So I find that to be fairly interesting. The one that we're going to talk about a little bit more and is very current is called golden rice. And so if you haven't heard of golden rice was created in response to a vitamin A deficiency. And it's developed through genetic engineering and has been added, the compound added to the grain is going to help with beta carotene uptake. And so it improves the grain's nutritive value. And the reason why it's called golden rice is because it actually is a different color. It's it's not white rice, it's more of a yellow rice. And so this introduction, the hope of this is that so many people around the world eat rice as a staple, and there is a lot of deficiency in populations, especially children, and this deficiency can cause blindness. And so the hope was that these researchers could create a food that would actually introduce a needed vitamin for populations. It's been held up quite a bit. It's a fairly political landscape for genetically modified organisms, and understanding exactly how that organism is going to respond in a natural environment versus in the lab is very important. So over decades, researchers have been looking at this, and only recently has it been allowed to be produced. And so there are finally now crops that are starting to be harvested and grown, and they're probably a couple years away from having a good seed source in order to give to other countries as countries would desire them. So, the potential for looking at plants and using plants in conjunction with some of these other genes from animal species and other plant species, it's very interesting work. I think that we all need to keep both of our eyes open and ask lots of questions about some of these products, but at the same time, I don't think that we need to be afraid of some of this research. I think that it's being done very intentionally and very well, and I don't see that it's going to stop. And so thinking about a way that we can live together with these new ideas and these new combinations that people are thinking of, and also doing it very safely is very important. Yeah, so you might hear more about golden rice in the future. The last section I wanted to discuss of this new field in botany is not new at all. And like so many of us, as we kind of get into this wild world and we get busy and life gets hectic, and oh my gosh, sometimes we just need to slow down. And this field of botany, ethnobotany, has really seen a strong revival. Not as strong as it could be, and I hope that it continues. But ethnobotany is really valuing and researching traditional uses for plants. So pretty much a full 180 from thinking about genetically modified organisms. This research takes botanists back to the roots of where some of these plants that we use came from, and finding the people that have been using these plants for generations and that it's part of their culture. How do they use these plants? And medicinally, culinarily, for ornamental purposes. There's so many tie-ins and connections that indigenous cultures have to their local plant systems, and a lot of this is being lost because of language barriers or just a lack of ability to keep certain cultural traditions alive as people move and have different interests. So this area of research is actually really, really important right now. And so I talked to a friend of mine who is doing this work, and she says that it's very exciting to document some of these species and some of these traditional uses, because she sees it as the ability to grow into the field of biomimicry, which is, using nature as inspiration to design buildings, clothing, also growing plants that could mitigate climate change, learning how to forage in a forest that we might not see value in, but listening to people that have been working that land for a long time, they have different opinions, and so we need to be respectful of that. And so she wanted to emphasize that her name is Abby Artemisia, and she's an amazing botanist. And so she learned from tribal communities that she works with that foraging is always done as a community. And she thinks the more we can figure out community together, including growing, harvesting, and processing food, the happier and healthier that we will be. And so that's very inspirational to be able to, take a step backwards from some of our, very intense type of lab work sometimes, and really get down and say, what are people using this plant for? And how can we, adapt that? I also found that Miss Valerie Pence, Dr. Pence, who we talked about last time, she responded to tell me that 40% of all the world's plants are facing the threat of extinction. And so she is very concerned about saving this biodiversity and conserving this biodiversity. But her hang up there is that there aren't enough people to do it. And so this was something that Abby also reiterated when I was speaking with her was, lots of botany programs at universities are being discontinued. And how do we make sure that we can still work with our plants and people and all of these different projects if we don't have new botanists coming into the field? And so what I wanted to leave you with today was that the future of botany is you. And how do we think about the ways that we can move together in this world and also do the field research and be talking to tribal communities and making sure that the genetic research that's happening is done in a safe and sustainable way. And so if you are passionate about plants and you want to keep going, there's definitely space for you in the botanical field. And so that's where I wanted to leave us today.